singer lines over and over, and I think she's there. And we all have our favourite nativity characters, don't we? I love the angels. The angel I think is pretty cool. We all have a favourite nativity character, but there's one that maybe we often miss off the normal nativity scenes. It's actually a character I've never seen in any nativity ever, and that is the dragon. Yes, the famous one. The dragon, because actually in one of the Bible's retellings of the Christmas story, the dragon features very highly, and that is Revelation 12. So that's where we're going to be going today, Revelation chapter 12. If you've got a Bible, feel free to turn to it. If you don't, the words will be on the screen, so that's totally fine. Let's just read through the first 6 verses. This is a sermon in 2 parts, so we're going to look at verses 1 to 6 today, and verses 7 to 17 next week. It says this: "And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant, and was crying out in birth pains, and the agony of giving birth. And then another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days." I decided to preach on this a few weeks ago, and I was preparing it this week, and thinking, I don't know how Christmassy this is it right? And then we were reading the Bible with the kids on Tuesday night, I think, before bed, Wednesday night. And we were looking at the story of Joseph, so nothing to do with this story. And then Evie decided to pray at the end. And I think she prayed something about Joseph. But then her prayer quickly went into, "And thank you, Lord, for the woman in Revelation 12, and the way that she fled from the dragon into the wilderness and you get her safe." And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. Of all the passages, she apparently had been reading Revelation chapter 12 that morning, as you do, and of all the passages in the Bible she could have read and then decided to just randomly pray out in the evening when we did nothing about that story, she did Revelation 12. So that was confirmation to me, sufficient confirmation that Revelation 12 was a good way to go today. That doesn't happen all the time, by the way. Our kids don't normally quote Revelation 12 in their prayers, or Revelation, or anything in the Bible. Right. It was an inspired by God moment. But there are 3 characters that are introduced in Revelation 12 in this story, in this retelling of the Nativity story. And we're going to go through each of these 3 characters in turn. And it's really the whole story of the Bible, actually. It's not just the Nativity story. It's the whole story of the Bible condensed into these verses. And it's presented as a great battle. And so the title today is The Great Battle, Part 1. Part 2 next week. And the 3 characters in the battle are the woman, the dragon, and the male child. And we're just going to follow through each of those in turn as we go through the story. So first of all, the woman in verse 1. It says, "A great sign appeared in heaven, and the woman was clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars." Bit of a strange picture. Here's this woman shining brightly as the sun, crowned with 12 stars on her head, the moon under her feet. Who is this woman? Well, if we go to Genesis chapter 37 and verse 9, this is the story of Joseph, of Multicoloured Coat fame and the musical. And most of us know the story because it's quite famous now in its retellings, but the story focuses on his dreams at the beginning. And in his dreams, one of his dreams is this dream of the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowing down to him. And that's the imagery this verse is picking up on. The sun is Jacob, Joseph's dad. The moon is his mum, Rachel. And the 11 stars are his brothers, all bowing down to him being the 12th star. So when we read about 12 stars and sun and moon, that should have, well, if we knew that verse, it would take us back to this passage. And in other words, a picture of the nation of Israel, the people of God in the Old Testament, because Joseph and his brothers, the 12 brothers, founded the 12 tribes of Israel. It's the nation of Israel came from this family. Okay, so that's who this woman is. It's the people of God, Israel, in the Old Testament. And when I read verse 1, I have a picture of a woman who's strong and serene. Here she is, maybe sitting on a throne or something. She's got a crown. She's shining brightly like the sun. It sounds like a beautiful image. But then verse 2 is a bit of a rude interruption, because verse 2, I'm suddenly a bit confused, because no longer is it a strong, sedate woman, because now we read about a woman who is going through the pain of childbirth. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. So actually this woman isn't really in a strong, serene position. She is in a position of weak vulnerability, crying out in the pain of childbirth. And this summarizes the story of the Old Testament and the people of Israel in the Old Testament, because there were people who over and over again were characterized by pain and suffering. They were enslaved and oppressed by Egypt for over 400 years. Then they wandered in the desert, not a particularly lovely place, for 40 years, suffering in different ways. Then even after entering their own land and occupying it, they were attacked by foreign empires and taken into captivity again. You read the story of the Old Testament, you see a lot of pain, you see a lot of suffering for God's people. But these experiences of Israel weren't just random pains. It wasn't just random suffering. It's described here as birth pains. And birth pains aren't random, they're pain with a purpose, they're pain with hope at the end of them. Isaiah 26 verse 17 speaks about Israel like a pregnant woman who writhes and cries out in her pangs when she's near to giving birth. So will we because of you, O Lord. And so Israel in the Old Testament is pictured here in Revelation 12 as a woman in the pains of childbirth. And so just as natural childbirth gives birth to something, there is hope at the end of it. So there is something about these pains that Israel experienced through the Old Testament which have hope at the end of them. They are not the end, they are hope-filled pains. Because alongside the thread running throughout the Old Testament of pain and suffering, there is another thread. And that's the thread of hope. It's the thread of the promise of God. The promise which centers around a child that this nation Israel will give birth to. Two examples. Isaiah 7 verse 14. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Or another one, Isaiah 9, 6-7. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. So we get this picture building throughout the Old Testament. On the one hand, Israel is suffering and in pain, it's oppressed and attacked. And on the other hand, throughout this whole story, again and again, God is promising them something. He is saying there is hope. A child is to be born to you, and out of this pain, something amazing will come. We see the consistent faithfulness of God, preserving his people Israel throughout all of the challenges, throughout all of the pain of the Old Testament. They could quite easily have been wiped out. And yet supernaturally, by the grace of God and the sovereign hand of God, they are preserved because he has a promise to them that he is yet to fulfill and that he will fulfill, because God always keeps his promises. Hallelujah. And so the first character to appear in our passage is the woman, crying out in the pains of childbirth, God's Old Testament people. And in verse 3 we read of another character. the dragon. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. And on his head were 7 diadems. We know from verse 9, we don't have to look back we could look back in the Old Testament to find the imagery for this, but we don't have to, because we're told in verse 9 who the dragon is. Explicitly it says that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan. So if the woman is God's Old Testament people, Israel, the dragon is Satan, the devil. This isn't literally what the devil looks like. There's all sorts of caricatures of the devil. And it's not saying, this passage isn't saying literally the devil is a dragon, but it's saying there's something of this symbol of the dragon which speaks to us of who the devil is. In other words, he is fierce and he attacks. That's who he is. He's a fierce attacker of God and of God's people and of God's purposes. That's his whole reason to exist. He is against all things of God and the people of God. He's depicted here with 7 heads, like a 7-headed monster. It's a pretty hideous image to try and picture it. He's a fierce, ugly dragon. The number 7 in the Bible symbolises completion or totality. And he also has 10 horns. And horns were a symbol of an animal's strength, so symbolised power and strength in the Old Testament and the Bible. And so here is God's enemy, the dragon, and he's symboled as one who has an oppressive power that has total worldwide influence. So much so in the New Testament, it speaks to the devil as the god of this world. He is opposing everything all over the world that God is doing and the people of God are doing. And in the Old Testament, his whole purpose was to attack the woman, Israel, God's people, in the ways that we've already considered. So why? Why is the dragon so fiercely against Israel in the Old Testament? Why does he attack this woman so violently? Because of the child. Because it's all about the child, this promised child that God has promised over and over again throughout the Bible. Because the dragon, the devil, knows the very first time this promise was made. Right at the beginning of the Bible, in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, the context is God has made a garden in a place called Eden, and he has put the first humans in this garden. And a serpent, the ancient serpent, that's the dragon, the same person, same character, the devil, has come and has tempted people, humans, and lured them away from obeying God into disobedience and living for themselves rather than for God. And when God comes, he announces curses over the man, over the woman, and over the serpent, the devil. And in Genesis 3, verse 15, we read this curse over the devil. It says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. What God spells out here, right at the start of the Bible, is the great battle. Beneath all the other battles. It's the one that is kind of keeps appearing in human form throughout the Old Testament as Israel is attacked again and again. The woman, that's Israel, is attacked. The descendants of Eve attacked again and again and again. The woman versus the dragon. The serpent, the dragon, keeps rearing its head, whether it's in the form of the Pharaoh of Egypt, whether it's in the oppressing slaves, whether it's in the form of captivity and exile as foreign empires attack Israel and try and wipe her out, whether it's in more subtle ways of idolatry, as they get mixed into other nations and get lured away slowly from the one true God and following the one true God. You see, the devil knows the second half of Genesis 3, verse 15. That the offspring of the woman will crush his head. He may strike that offspring's heel, in other words, cause a little bit of harm to the offspring of Eve, to this great descendant of Eve. But he, the offspring, is going to cause the fatal blow. because crushing a serpent's head is fatal. And so the devil knows it. And so enters the third character in the drama of Revelation 12, the male child, the one this whole battle centres on. Let's read verses 4 and 5. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore the child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. This male child is the one who was born to rule the nations. The dragon is so opposed to the woman, to Israel, because of this child. Because he knows the promise of Genesis 3:15 that his head will be crushed by it. Because he knows the promise of Isaiah 9 verse 6 to 7 that this child will be born who will rule, who will reign, that will sit on the throne of government forever, kick Satan off his current throne in this world. And so he threw everything he could at Israel. He threw slavery, he threw idolatry, he threw captivity at her, trying to prevent this child from being born. This child who would be the great dragon slayer. But the purposes of God cannot be thwarted. The plans of God cannot be stopped by a dragon, however fierce, however ferocious, however powerful in this world he may seem to be. And God is always faithful to his promises. And he promised a child would be born. So he preserved Israel. This child truly would be born who would come to rule the nations. And so we get to Matthew chapter 1, verses 21 to 25, and we read these glorious verses, which are the fulfillment of centuries of promises that God has made to his people, the woman Israel. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord has spoken by the prophet and many other prophets that could have been quoted. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, which they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph woke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took his wife, but knew her not until she had given birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. The male child has been born. The message of Christmas is that this promised child has come. It's that the dragon is going to be defeated. It's that Israel's birth pains, centuries of pain and suffering waiting for the fulfillment of the promise, have now come to an end. That God is faithful. The story doesn't end with the birth of a child, which is quite good news, because a child being born surely can't defeat a dragon. It's a baby, it's just a child. It can't defeat a dragon. But the good news of Christmas, the angels declare to the shepherds, is good news because the baby grows up. And the dragon knows that the baby's going to grow up. That's why in verse 4 it says the dragon stood before the woman so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. And so the focus of the dragon's attention shifts as soon as Jesus is born from the woman Israel onto the child that has now been born, Jesus Christ himself. And so turn over from Matthew chapter 1 to Matthew chapter 2, and immediately you get the attack starting. In Matthew 2:16 we read of Herod killing all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or younger. This is the dragon working again through Herod, trying to kill off Jesus, this promised child. But he fails. And he fails again and again and again, because the dragon's attacks continue. How about Matthew chapter 4, when the devil appears to Jesus in the desert and tries to tempt him away from going through with the call, because he knows that if he keeps going, if he keeps being obedient to God, to death on a cross, then he will be crushed by him. And so he tries to lure him off course, but once again, he fails. Or Luke chapter 4, verse 29, when the people of Nazareth take Jesus to the edge of a cliff and try to throw him off because they're so angry with him, but he just walks on through the crowd. because the dragon has no power over him. Or in John 13, verse 2, where we read explicitly that the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray Jesus. The dragon even appears through one of his friends, trying to betray him and get rid of him. And then finally, when he thinks his work is done, on a dark afternoon in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, onlookers are looking at this cross where Jesus of Nazareth has a sign above his head saying, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, where he is humiliated and shamed and defeated, and it looks like the battle is over and the dragon has won because the child, now grown up as Jesus himself, has been defeated. But what the dragon didn't factor in was who this man was. What do those promises say? The virgin will be with child, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. What does that mean? God with us. This child is God in human flesh. This man on the cross is God in human flesh. Or Isaiah 9, he shall be called Mighty God. That's Christmas. God has come to us to defeat the dragon, and he does it once and for all on the cross as he died. And so we read at the end of verse 5, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Because death couldn't keep God down. God has the power to take life and to give life. And 3 days after he died, God rose Jesus up from the dead again, defeating the dragon and all of his power once and for all, crushing the head of the serpent. And now he's caught up to the throne of God, because right now, where is he? He is ruling at the right hand of the Father with all power and with all authority. And one day, he's going to return to earth. That's the other part of the Advent message. Yes, we look back to the way Jesus has come, but we look forward to the fact that he's going to come again. And this time he's not going to come as a baby in a manger. He's going to come as a warrior king. Listen to how it's described in Revelation 19, verse 11. Then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, and he has the name written that no one knows but himself. And in verse 15 goes on to say, and he will rule the nations with a rod of iron. He's coming back, and he's going to come back as a warrior king, ruling the nations forevermore. Not ruling not ruling and reigning like the devil tries to have in the world at the moment, which is causing chaos, but ruling and reigning, as we've heard already, where he's going to make all things new, where he's going to restore all things to how they are originally intended to be. And where's the dragon going to be? Just turn over to Revelation 20, and you see he's going to be thrown into the fire, into the lake of fire and sulfur, and be utterly destroyed. His rule on this earth will be completely finished. The dragon couldn't stop the birth of Jesus. The dragon couldn't stop the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus. And the dragon will not be able to stop the return and ultimate rule forevermore of Jesus. The verse in Revelation 12 says he is to rule the nations with a rod of iron. Not maybe, not possibly, not always hope he wins. This isn't an equal and opposite battle. He has won on the cross, and one day when he returns, that victory will be made complete for all to see. And every eye will see, every knee will bow, every heart will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord and is ruling to the glory of God the Father. But right now, we're living between the times, between the cross and the return of Jesus. We're in the position of the woman in verse 6. And that's where we're going to pick up next time what it is. Because where was the woman in verse 6? She was in the wilderness, it says. She's fled to the wilderness. And we're going to look at what it means to be in the wilderness in this in-between times next week. But for today, I want us to fix our eyes on two characteristics of God as we draw to a close that have come up from our verses. Number one, God is faithful. God is faithful. The birth of this child was the fulfillment of God's promises. Now, loads of times in the Old Testament, I'm sure the pain of Israel was so great, they were thinking, God, is this promise that you made to us ever going to come about? We're waiting, it feels so dark. Where are you, Lord, in this? And for some of us, we might feel the same. We might think, Jesus, are you ever going to come back? We're waiting. It's been 2,000 years. You said it would be soon. This doesn't feel very soon. Or maybe it's just specific things in our lives, promises God has made to us. We're waiting, and life just feels so dark. You need to know that God is faithful, and he makes his promises, and he keeps his promises. And he will do that for you. Secondly, God rules. God rules. The dragon thought, and he still thinks he's powerful. He's trying his best to cause as much damage as he can, particularly to the people of God. We'll look more at his strategies next week, but for now, I want us to know that God is greater. God is greater. The dragon doesn't reign, God does. The dragon doesn't possess the rod of iron with which to rule the nations. Jesus, the Son of God, does. And ultimately, the dragon has been defeated through the cross of Christ. And one day, that victory will be on display for the whole world to see. Are we going to bow the knee today? One day we'll be forced to bow the knee. There'll be nothing else to do. But day by day as we live our lives now, are we going to, yes, he reigns, but are we going to allow him to reign and rule in our lives? Let's pray.